Hello, my name's Jared Seeger. You might know me as Jared Seeger. I don't really have a stage name. And welcome to Bit by Bit. This will be a comedy tutorial guide series. And as that name might suggest, I am a stand-up comedian. I've been doing comedy for about 3 years now, and it's been just long enough that I've gained a retrospective on my comedy career, I guess you could say. It's no longer something I'm doing, it's also something I've done. I can think back to my first performance back in high school, where I was making such bold claims about how we all wear clothing.
Dressed appropriately, hope I'm in this dress code, like life's dress code, you know. Because life does have a dress code. I figured this out. There are very few things you can do that are not affected by what clothes you're wearing.
Very astute observations, Jared. But I can not only think back to that time, but I can think back to the time that led up to it, where I was making the leap from a comedy enthusiast to a comedy performer, and got me thinking that maybe I could make some tutorial videos of some sort to help other people take those first steps. Now, you might be thinking, Jared, you only have 3 years of experience. Shouldn't I be listening to somebody with like 10 years of experience? Who are you to say anything? And that's a very reasonable thing to say. And when it comes to comedy as a whole, I would definitely recommend you talk to actual experts with a few decades of experience rather than me. But with those very successful comedians, I find that by the time they make it, the comedy scene that they came up in has completely changed. This means that their advice for starting out doesn't really come in handy in 2020 as much as it did back in 2010. So in that way, a beginner like me might have some good advice for people. I don't know, we'll figure it out. I also find that when it comes to comedy tutorials, what people call rule number 1 or step 1 is typically more like step 10. There's so much extra work that goes into the time before your first performance that I feel a lot of tutorials don't cover. So with this series, I've decided we are going to actually conclude these videos with rule number 1. We'll work our way up to the first step, and these little videos will serve as a sort of prologue. So if we're not starting with rule number 1, we might as well start at the beginning, back in 1960 with comedians like Lenny Bruce and George Carlin. Now, a lot of you are probably more familiar with Carlin than you are with Bruce, so I'll use him as my main example for comedy of this time. Carlin in particular was very important in turning comedy into what it is today. I'm not saying he was the first stand-up comedian. There's examples of that going way further back than 1960. But in terms of how we currently define stand-up, Carlin's kind of the Adam and Eve mashed together. These metaphors are gonna get really weird. Bottom line is, George Carlin talked about what wasn't talked about, and he used comedy as the medium to do so. The cycle this started was one I kind of explained like this. Imagine in society we have this pool of the taboo, full of things that we're not supposed to say, words we can never mutter. And comedians, or people in general like Carlin, come along, take someone out of the pool and say, why don't we talk about this? This gets them two types of attention. Either people going, you're not supposed to talk about that. Or people going, finally somebody's talking about this. Both are types of attention regardless, and gain this comedian a sort of notoriety. So much so that other aspiring comedians start to take inspiration from that idea, riff off the same material, talk about similar things. All those comedians then become even more famous to the point where this taboo subject is no longer taboo. In this way, I think comedy plays a very crucial role in society. It allows us to desensitize ourselves to certain things so we can talk about them in a more productive manner. Now for the comedian, it's not as good because now you can't talk about the taboo thing. It's common knowledge. So they go back down to the pool of the taboo to draw out a new subject, and we keep going through this on and on until we've covered every single thing, but that will never happen because we always have new shit we're not supposed to talk about. Now this of course doesn't encompass all of comedy. Quite the opposite, it's only one end of the spectrum. On the other end we had comedians like Steve Martin and Bill Cosby representing the family-friendly side of comedy. And yes, there was a time where you could mention the words Bill Cosby and family-friendly in the same sentence and it made sense. Different times. Nevertheless, these comedians brought the subject matter a little closer to home, more down to earth. They talked about everyday things, which in turn spawned a whole other subcategory of comedy, the observational comedians like Jerry Seinfeld, Stephen Wright, and so on. Now, I mention all these early names in comedy, but I don't really watch them. Yes, I know I'm a heretic or whatever, but honestly, it's because these comedians were so influential that they're kind of hard to watch. Every subsequent comedian that came out after them was basing themselves a little bit off George Carlin, a little bit off Stephen Wright, to the point where you can't watch a single comedian that hasn't been influenced by that. That sense of humor has now become the baseline that future comedians built their comedic voices off of. I say this to get across 2 points. 1, the comedy scene is constantly changing, and 2, comedians base their work off one another. It's not plagiarism, it's inspiration, like any other art form. And this is where the first step that you can actually do comes in. Chances are, if you've gotten this far, you have a comedian you like. So your first assignment's quite simple. Watch that comedian as much as you can. Find everything, not just the stand-up specials. Find recordings of them from comedy festivals or open mics. Listen to similar comedians, listen to comedians that are the exact opposite. Immerse yourself in the art form and you will start to subconsciously take notes on the joke anatomy and general comedic voice you want to emulate in your own stand-up. Once you've done that, then you can start to ask yourself the question of, what makes this joke funny? Why do I like comedian A but not comedian B? As contradictory as it sounds, there is a taboo in the comedy world, is that you're not supposed to explain jokes that makes them not funny. Which, I get why people say that, but I would say there's a difference between explaining a joke in an attempt to make it funny, and thinking a joke is funny, and then trying to explain it. One helps you learn, the other one is just a failed attempt that you tried to recover. So I'll give that to you as your first assignment. Go watch comedy, start to take mental notes, and get an idea of the style you want to do. This will be very important for the next episode, where I'm going to be talking about gathering material. Anyway, that'll be it for right now. I'll see you guys in the next one, and as always, have a good one.